couple of weeks ago, I posted a video reviewing the 2025 live-action remake of How to Train Your Dragon. In it, I discussed some of the changes it had compared to the original 2010 animated film, and also discussed the ways in which I arguably actually prefer the remake as a viewer experience. I know that that isn't exactly going to be the most popular opinion in the world, and I might get flack on this video for suggesting such heresy so boldly in the very first paragraph, but if you want to listen to my review on the remake specifically, you can do so by checking out the description. If you would prefer to read that review for some reason, you can check out my Letterboxd profile, which is also linked in the description below. The purpose of bringing that up is simply to say that this review of the animated How to Train Your Dragon trilogy is going to be essentially separate from my thoughts on the remake. I'm still likely to bring up an applicable point here or there, borrowed from that other review, and I will likely comment about certain aspects of live-action adaptation here and there as well for the second and third film. But for all intents and purposes, this video is relegated to reviewing the original animated trilogy released in 2010, 2014, and 2018. But since this video will surely be more than long enough as is, why don't we skip any additional preliminary chit-chat as I am typically wont to draw out, because I can scarcely seem to help myself, and skip straight into the body of the video. Do be forewarned, however, spoilers will not be kept in check in this video, and I will not specify points when spoilers are discussed in any film. If you have not watched all three of the movies, I recommend you do so. They are worth it, and I'd hate to be the one to ruin one of them. I rewatched How to Train Your Dragon for the first time in several years quite recently, within a week or two of watching the remake. And by several years, I mean, I think it was probably a solid 2 to 3 years before The Hidden World came out. And I had probably only watched this original film a handful of times in the first place anyway. I always remembered it being a fantastic movie, but considering it an active favorite might have been pushing it a bit too far during that time period. But because I remembered it being good, and because I enjoyed the remake as much as I did, I expected no less than to love How to Train Your Dragon once more. To absolutely nobody's surprise, I did. But as I mentioned in the intro and in the review of the remake, outside of one scene cut that does not make any sense to me, I largely preferred watching the remake. In the end, now that I've had some weeks to think about why more specifically, I think this comes down to 3 things: the pacing, sound mixing, and general visual style. On the matter of the foremost, that being pacing, you can check out the remake review to learn a little bit more. In short, it being live action, actual dialogue and character action has to match that of more or less the average person, more so than animation necessitates. As a result of nothing more than personal preference, the slight extra space this allowed in the remake made just about every moment of the remake hit more profoundly for me. In that way, rewatching the original afterwards may have been a mistake. It meant that in doing so, I was struck by just how quickly this movie actually moves. I'm willing to grant that this aspect was almost certainly exacerbated by the fact of my relative unfamiliarity with the movie being so many years removed from it. Choosing to rewatch the original after, when I already had a sharp image of how much I enjoyed the remake in the theater, simply left me feeling like all the story beats that I thought were perfect in the remake, on account of it being fresh of mind, were coming and going too quickly in the animated one. Many fans are not going to like this opinion, but I promise you it is no slight to this, the original film. After all, my rating for both films is 4.5 out of 5. I absolutely do not need to explain that this film is still a classic. Yet, there are a couple of relatively objective measures that actually hold it back a bit more than my memory propped it up as. That leads us to the second thing mentioned earlier: sound mixing. Obviously, animated filmography contains sound design, and especially dialogue mixing in accordance with this, that is executed incredibly different from live action films. The difference in medium makes this point inherent. My rewatch of How to Train Your Dragon unfortunately brought to light many subtle things that distracted me a tiny bit in the end. In the opening, for example, a lot of character dialogue when rushing about Burke is really quick and cut together in such a way that spatial placement of it doesn't really sit right. Again, I noticed this in large part because I had the remake fresh of mind for comparison, but the general sound design follows this kind of trend. Essentially, everything sounded like it was recorded in a booth and inserted into the film's edit. I wasn't fully immersed, if that makes sense. It is a very, very minor complaint, but I did notice it. Finally, the third point is that of general visual presentation. I don't love the cartoonish nature of most animated filmmaking, especially that designed and targeted at kids. Again, this is mostly a personal preference thing, but I found I very much prefer things more grounded. I never watched cartoons growing up, as I didn't have access, and I have never even so much as watched anime unironically, which seems to be shockingly uncommon amongst my generation that I know. Seriously, I sometimes wonder if every single chronically online individual watches anime and I'm the only one who doesn't touch it. Anyway, I don't really watch much film or TV in the first place, and haven't in many years. And 99% of what I do watch is live action. So I guess I'm just not primed for enjoying most animated material anymore. To get more to the point, this doesn't even necessarily have much to do with How to Train Your Dragon in the first place, but just as the live action had a couple moments where the translation of the mildly cartoonish didn't translate to the live action setting the best, I feel like there are moments of the animated version that were just straight up slightly too cartoony for me. Again, coming from a place of personal preference. The movie isn't that cartoony at all, and I can overlook it easily, but it is still something I notice. But now that I say all that, I realize, or rather remember, that that's not even the point I was going to make about the visuals. This film looks a lot more scuffed than I remember, and that's not just because I watched it on DVD as opposed to Blu-ray or something. I mean, comparing it to even just the other films in the trilogy, this debut looks so much less good. At first, I thought this was largely budget/time related, where the 4 years in between each film and presumably higher budgets, not to mention technology advancements, of the two sequels would be the reason for this. The problem is, the budget for the movies actually got smaller as the trilogy went on, so it must be almost entirely a technology thing. But either way, How to Train Your Dragon has actually started to age a little bit. I definitely noticed it didn't look as good as in my memory, and that slightly affected my enjoyment. But just realize that while I express these complaints, minor as they are, and they are minor, recall that I said the film is still a classic, and that is unquestionable. I mean, one of my complaints for the remake was that Hiccup's actor's voice is simply not the original's. Is that a bad thing? I mean, not necessarily, but when the opening and closing monologues of the original How to Train Your Dragon are so incredibly iconic and memorable, it actually makes a difference. That much was enough to really suck me back into the world and these films upon my rewatch, and I have reason to believe I'll watch these films all again at least a few more times over the years, assuming I watch any movies over the years. God only knows how much I struggle to prioritize film over books, music, and video games. And more than just Hiccup's voice, too. The character and dragon designs are also incredibly iconic and memorable, and several cinematographic decisions are more effective and noticeable as well. In whole, the little details of the final product coalesce to a whole that makes the popularity of this film obvious. There is subtext to the actual filmmaking that supports the story, and catching a lot of that on this go-around was super rewarding. Unfortunately, a lot of the side characters feel like they have a tad less depth, reliant as they are on their more cartoonishly distinct characteristics, as opposed to the somewhat expanded characterization of the live action. But to say that you don't remember who all the main cast is in this movie would be absurd on its face. It's impossible. Same thing with the dragons. Too many are too memorable. I'd argue the original in its dragon lore book mentioned way too many species that are never utilized in the movie, and they're too glossed over here for me to remember off the top of my head whether the extras appear in the sequels, but that doesn't keep the primary cast of dragons from being itself iconic. And really, that's how I ought to close this specific review. How to Train Your Dragon is iconic. It remained so on my rewatch, and I expect it to remain as much more or less into perpetuity. Even if I slightly prefer the remake, it'd be an objective lie to claim that I didn't still love the original. It'd be an even bigger lie to say it doesn't open what I've decided might be one of the best film trilogies out there. When I watched and thought about both versions of How to Train Your Dragon, the primary word that comes to mind is heart. Whatever minor qualms I may have about either version in their own ways, there's heart to the products. Stories about real lessons and morals, tragedies and triumphs, and performances to wrap up everything in an emotionally impactful little bow. As it turns out, the first movie, whether animated or live action, is not the only property of this IP with heart. How to Train Your Dragon 2 retains at least that aspect absolutely. When I went to watch the live-action remake of the original movie last month, I was actually fairly surprised by what the film had to offer, both in emotional impact that my younger self didn't quite remember, and in the actual story being told. If you recall, it had been a good long while since the last time I had seen the original film in the first place, and this sequel was no different in that way. In fact, I don't think I had even watched the sequel more than a couple of times, and neither time more than a year or two after it was released. If my best estimate can be trusted, it was certainly at least a couple years before The Hidden World on either case. This little factoid is relevant because many of the mere handful of scenes I remember from the first movie were not, in fact, even from the first movie. They were from How to Train Your Dragon 2. Relatedly, I also for many years thought that I remembered the sequel more fondly, that I liked it better. Unfortunately, I was a bit disappointed to come out of the second film finding it notably weaker in all but the first act. Not that much weaker, mind you, but notably weaker still. Keep in mind, however, that I would still give this film a 4 out of 5 rating, where the second half of the film manages to quash just enough of how damn good the first half is to bother me. Like, a lot of the movie is good, and what is good is phenomenal, but there are issues too. To start, and to say it outright, I think the opening of How to Train Your Dragon 2 is the strongest of the trilogy, full stop. It's not even particularly close in my mind. Watching fairly soon after the first installment showed me on a technical level how much objectively improved it was, as in visuals, sound design, and other general artistic decisions, which all allowed for something more immediately wowing than the first movie. Seriously, the animation alone is such a massive step up that I would never have guessed the budget for it is lower. But apparently the sheer increase in technological capabilities and a team that understood what visual style they had in mind right from the get-go really allowed for this film to be a visual feast. Even the standard edition DVD managed to get a visceral reaction out of me in this regard, whereas I could tell that the original's animation is starting to age a little bit by now. Additionally, the little intricacies of sound mixing and design and the like that distracted me a tiny bit at times in the first movie were completely gone. Yet the technical aspect of this film isn't all that impressed me. It remains a defining feature of the film throughout, of course, but the reason the opening act of How to Train Your Dragon 2 wowed me more at the start was simply because the story and character setups are so well done, also arguably the best of the trilogy. Not only do we see immediately the growth that the Burkians have had over the 5 years from the time the first movie takes place, but the distinctiveness of those characters' personalities let emotional and thematic setup to take place incredibly naturally. This is most notably the case in Hiccup, which makes sense, but in general, the idea of the familial bond, both literal and figurative, being a cohesive, greater unit worth protecting and investing in, even in the face of stark sacrifice, is such a good one. It also allows for all of the right kinds of emotional moments throughout the movie, while also teaching younger viewers about the stakes involved in that. As my favorite book series has made a motto over the years, seek hardship. Actually, ironically, said favorite book series, Sun Eater by Christopher Arracchio, also has a character named Valka, which is the name of Hiccup's mother. And I mean, no greater way to explore the themes of the film than by introducing Valka as a primary character of the narrative and allowing her to interact not just with Hiccup himself, but also his father, Stoic. It's genuinely great stuff, and building upon the opening of the film as well as the first film entire, How to Train Your Dragon 2 tackles certain ideas of identity and purpose in great ways, a theme of the entire trilogy, though we'll talk more on this with The Hidden World. But with Valka's introduction, the film sees the bulk of its second act ensue. I'm still mildly mixed on the second act. As far as the thematic and character interaction strengths of the film, I love getting to see Stoic and Valka reignite their love, while Hiccup gets to actually meet her. I also love the fairly secluded nest with a friendly alpha and hundreds of other dragons safe and sound, aided by and partnered with Valka. The reason that I'm a little bit conflicted on my thoughts of the second act of the film is that while I found all of this material to be engaging and great, the way it spaces out the other parts of the film and the way that Hiccup and Toothless spent a while separated from their friends, and they too separated from Gobber and Stoic, meant the exact spacing of storylines here didn't fully pan out. Especially underserved by this was the villain, and the climax of the second act as a direct result, which did not pave the way for a better third act. I just found much of the back half of the film to be a disappointment outside of a handful of moments. I think How to Train Your Dragon 2 suffers predominantly, if you can truly call it suffering, from its messy climax and underwhelming villain. While I found aspects of the second act to be ever so slightly unpolished in the pacing department, despite how good most of its material manages to be, I yet found those minor issues to be very minor indeed. Comparatively, the climactic sequence up until the epilogue is pretty messy. Unfortunately, I just do not find Drago Bloodfist to be interesting, basically at all. In the first act, when he is merely referred to, he sounds like an entirely menacing character with a completely nihilistic lack of moral code, something that would honestly work super well in a children's movie if executed well. The problem is that when Hiccup's friends all meet him, he fails to exude any of that menace. He came off as arguably the most stereotypical cartoon villain they could have made for the movie. It just felt so wrong when the movie is otherwise tackling ideas with depth of value, and then the villain winds up being some random nobody who only forces the characters to confront mortality superficially in ways that feel entirely cartoonish and unbelievable. I mean, this guy literally waves a staff around, yelling like a lunatic to get the attention of the alpha dragon he plans to use to take over the world, and for some reason the alpha tolerates this. It just doesn't work for me. As a result, I simply couldn't even be arsed to care about the stakes of this film. Drago takes his horde of dragons, creatures which he has surprisingly unclear motivations around aside from haha, take over the world, but apparently he has an alpha equal to that of the nest where Valka lives, and he causes a confrontation. It's alright, I guess, but the big alpha versus big alpha fight did nothing for me. It doesn't manage to have any emotional stakes whatsoever, and so when Drago's alpha kills the other and gains control over all the dragons, the only reason I really cared was because even Toothless was caught in the turning of the tide. The emotional investment doesn't come from the battle itself, but rather from Toothless being turned against Hiccup and ultimately catching Stoic in the crossfire instead. Don't get me wrong, this moment hits super heavy. It was very emotional. I had forgotten it even happened, and I cried watching it, but I could also scarcely believe it because Drago's sway over his alpha just doesn't make sense to me, not even a little bit. This problem is exacerbated by Drago's character in and of himself. As time goes on, the villain that was built up as a real bad deal in the first act grows more and more incompetent, despite certain of his supposed villainous accomplishments clearly being of the variety that only an extraordinarily competent villain could achieve. Each moment that passed in the climax into the final moments sees him grow more and more into an utter buffoon whom I could not take seriously. Not one single person with a single brain cell sparking up in his dome would let Hiccup regain Toothless the way Drago does. The disconnect is palpable. And now remember when I mentioned a nihilistic lack of moral code? Yeah, this disappears in about 5 milliseconds too. Rather than nihilism, Drago becomes a manifestation of petty narcissism, and rather than a lack of moral code, or anything interestingly similar, we instead get a man whose only code is rules for thee, but not for me, which he grows petulant about when it turns out that anybody besides him has sway over dragons, and thus the power to do anything against him. I found that core foundation of his character to be disinteresting, uninspired, and underserved in the final product, and so simply couldn't take basically all of the back half of the film seriously, outside of the isolated moments of Hiccup losing Toothless and the dragon inadvertently killing Stoic. Drago is just a big nothing burger for me. Perhaps this is why, despite wanting to explore more of the character, Drago was ultimately cut from the third movie. Honestly, good riddance. So what about the rest of the final act? I mean, it's fine, I guess, but because I don't really care about Drago and only care about his assault on Burke insofar as I care about the Burkians, which should be a lot, but it wasn't true investment, and because he manages to be a complete wet noodle of an enemy, nothing really works in the end. I already mentioned how unbelievable it is that Drago just lets Hiccup regain Toothless. This remains part of the problem. I already mentioned the stupid, silly Neanderthal behavior to control his alpha. This is even worse here now that he's actively competing with Toothless. Of course, Toothless comes out winning control over the dragon horde. The now former alpha decides to back off, and the film is basically won, and we never see Drago again. It's not bad, but after how good the first half is, the villain and general conceit for the back half is just so underwhelming. But as I said up top, the movie is still very good. I give How to Train Your Dragon 2 a 4 out of 5 easily, and when I choose to ignore the back half and focus on the front half, that score wavers pretty close to 4.5 out of 5. That all said, I actually think this film will be serviced well by the upcoming live-action remake it too will see in a couple of years. Given the way that the first film's remake slightly expanded characters, I'm hoping that the remake for the sequel will follow that same trend and just kind of make the back half of the movie less of a disjointed question mark and into something that actually has the stakes it needed. With good execution, I could see it being notably better than this film. But on that note, I do have to say, however, that there are actually certain sequences in the movie that aren't likely to translate to live action super effectively, so I wonder how some of those things will be handled as well. Either way, I'll be there to watch the remake when it comes out. Different from my recent viewings of How to Train Your Dragon and its sequel, which were rewatches, this was actually the very first time I watched The Hidden World, the third and final film of the trilogy. I wasn't unfamiliar with it per se, as there are several meme templates that have emerged from the movie, but outside of the knowledge that those memes provided, such as including a female variant of Toothless's dragon species and Hiccup growing a beard at some point in it, that of course being the epilogue of the film, I didn't actually know what this movie was about. In that way, I was super excited to actually get to experience it. I'd been out of the loop enough that I didn't really know the common sentiment around the hidden world, and definitely not in comparison to the first two films of the property, so it was effectively like going in truly blind aside from the aforementioned memes and whatnot. What did I think? Well, it's not quite as simple to explain as I would hope, but to say it straight out early, I loved the hidden world just as much as the other two films. While the first film is a 4.5 out of 5 for me, and the second is a 4 out of 5, the hidden world is also still in the 4 to 4.5 rating range as well. By the end of this review, I'll have come to a more firm conclusion, but before talking about it a little bit more, I had yet to decide properly on a score, but it is also up there with the other two. But the reasons for why I don't know yet my final ratings for the film are wide. So let's dive into some of those topics now. First of all, on a technical level, this film is honestly just so incredible to watch. I already thought the sequel was a massive step up for the trilogy's visual and general production value, but the threequel somehow manages to top things one more time. It is genuinely breathtaking how good this film looks and sounds, so in that way, I probably had the best viewer experience with it. Beyond the technical angle, I'd say The Hidden World strikes me as incredibly consistent of a movie, which is both a good thing and a slight dig, funny enough. You see, the first movie is consistently great, but also has a handful of peak moments littered throughout. The second film has a first half that is just unbelievably good, but a back half that really disappoints in a lot of ways. The third film, while having a couple minor dips at moments, which we will discuss in time, also doesn't have many of the peaks the first two do. So, in an ironic twist, it manages to be more consistent than them, but that lack of absolute peak also is a little bit disappointing. I mean, the ending is great. We'll talk about that as well, but my point still stands. Though I ought to clarify one thing, the epilogue of this film is peak, and is what ultimately brought the entire thing to a close in a way I adored, whereas prior to the epilogue it was handily my least favorite of the trilogy. The thing that I think the film does best broad scale, however, is continue and finalize the exploration of personal identity as a theme, something that the first two films set up quite well. The first two movies arguably spend too much time on plot comparatively, at least for my tastes, but the things they do tackle as far as identity is concerned for Hiccup is incredible and lays the groundwork for this final film equally as well. Obviously, in the first film, Hiccup's identity as a Viking, and trying so hard to become renowned by taking down a Night Fury, ends up being something he really has to tackle. He manages to shoot one down, but finds himself unable, or unwilling rather, to kill it. He chooses instead to help the injured dragon learn to fly again, becoming a unit with the beast. He shirks the traditional Viking identity for the sake of doing what he feels is right, and so he finds identity in that. It at first loses him his father, but even Stoic comes around in the end, and Hiccup's role as pillar for change is highly regarded. In the second film, the identity theme is a little less apparent, but it is still there, largely as a result of the single most emotional moment of the movie. Hiccup doesn't feel he's the right man for being the head of Berk, similarly to how he implicitly understood in the first film that he was not the right man for the traditional Viking lifestyle. Yet Stoic and the rest of the village trust him, and when Stoic sacrifices himself for his son, he is able to start to pave a way for leadership alongside Toothless, as an alpha for the dragons of the community by the end, to take Burke to new heights, but his traditional leadership skills are somewhat lacking. No less is this made true than by the opening of The Hidden World, where Hiccup's source of identity comes from saving dragons, adding them to the horde cared for at Burke. He is also, for some reason, after a year since the second movie took place, in uncertain waters where Astrid is concerned, something that has likely been an additional motivation for focusing so hard on dragons and little else. When one has little confidence in their own self, then big changes cause them to dive ever deeper into the things they think make them who they are, no matter how accurate or misguided that may end up being. For being the head chief of Burke, his leadership causes no amount of stress for his people, but what they really want most for him is to become the man he is meant to be. What do I mean by this? Well, the film itself largely explains, in no small part by being the most actively engaged of the trilogy with the themes. In more ways than one is The Hidden World the most mature entry of the trilogy, but we'll come back to this point a little bit later. Let's next discuss a couple of the other things I enjoyed about The Hidden World. I really appreciate the interchange of romance stories in the movie, where I find the Hiccup and Astrid being hesitant about marriage a bit forced in execution at times. The way that this is handled in concurrence with the romance between Toothless and the Light Fury makes for a fun and humorous experience. Sure, the pacing of the middle of the film with said dragon romance can be at times a bit overwrought in my opinion, with a bit too much time spent on awkward mating rituals that nearly killed me through secondhand embarrassment, but the placement of the plot and the way this ties into the themes of identity are super special. Again, we'll return to this. Though it felt a tiny bit off, I respected the film for waiting until after a cold open sequence to actually bring out the "This is Burke" opening monologue. It definitely bucks the trend a little bit here, but I honestly loved the decision narratively. It also allowed for the epilogue to be as good as it is. After all, The Hidden World sees the Burkians actually leave Burke, motivated by the movements and plots of the villain, who I also really liked in this film. So closing the movie with a "This is Burke" monologue wouldn't really work. So the film opens with a short scene prior to the monologue, and then the monologue at the end serves to close the entire trilogy. And that, I think, totally works here, even if it is a little bit different from the first two movies. And on the note of the villain, I gotta say that I really enjoyed his presence and how it wrapped up aspects of the trilogy that had not been properly addressed full force yet. Sure, Grimmel is a little bit stereotypical, but he's not as uninspired as Drago felt. A lot of this was because he, to some degree, ties the entire trilogy together, even from off-screen. Grimmel is a dragon hunter, but not just any dragon hunter, the dragon hunter, the one who put the Night Fury species nearly to extinction. And his goal in this film is to finish doing precisely that. Given that both the first and second films mention Toothless being one of his kind or wanting to search for others like him, it was very nice for the story direction itself to confront that head on. Grimmel is, after all, the one who has imprisoned the Light Fury and, presumably having heard tales of Hiccup and Toothless by that time, intends to use the she-beast to lure out Toothless so that he can kill them both after his disturbing fashion, whatever that may be. His desire to kill all the dragons also just seems less disappointingly generic to me than does Drago's desire to control them, somehow, in order to take over the world. As I said before, Grimmel doesn't necessarily avoid the trap of being stereotypical in his own way, but his writing has layers and the vocal performance is such that he actually had presence. Besides, the opposite stereotype meant that the climax of the movie wasn't just another big dragon v big dragon fight, which is inherently better than the climax of How to Train Your Dragon 2. Finally, he also goes a long way in reinforcing the thematic exploration of the film. Which I suppose leads me to actually finish that tangent I've left hanging for a while now. Identity. Hiccup's struggle with identity in this film is not in regards to support from other people, though he does still have to combat that. It's in the fact that Toothless has become an inherent part of himself. Really, it's as simple as that. Hiccup does not think of himself as Hiccup without Toothless, and he does not think to let Toothless be his own creature to any capacity, nor does Toothless have any reason to want to be. Like a dog, Toothless is loyal to the end, until he discovers the love interest. Hiccup finally has to start encouraging the dragon, letting him go and be himself. He finally has a reason to perfect the technology that will let the dragon fly without him, and Toothless finally has a reason to want it. This is difficult for Hiccup. Very difficult. And the closer the film comes to its close, the more it emotionally got to me as the viewer. Side note, I'm willing to overlook a lot on the technology front for these movies, but I have to admit I'm less solid on the functionality of the device that lets Toothless fly on his own. Anyway, when Hiccup has to let Toothless go off and hang out with a female counterpart, he has to let go of some part of himself that relies on the dragon to be himself. Grimmel reinforces this point by mocking Hiccup, saying that he is nothing without that dragon. Hiccup believes him, too. This film confronts that identity crisis head on, and it does so very well, by using fan service in just the right way. Now, the second movie had some callbacks to the first, and the third movie has them as well. This is not in and of itself a bad thing to me. In general, I actually tend to support and enjoy fan service when it's not done just for the sake of it. In the case of this trilogy, some examples are a little bit worse than others, for some of them come off as borderline cheesy, even cartoonish at times, so that I was just as inclined to roll my eyes as I was to point at the screen like Leonardo DiCaprio. But the third film largely does fan service well, and the moment when Hiccup is forced to come up with the idea to spring out the dragons and rescue the Furies is one ripped straight out of the first movie. It shows Astrid telling Hiccup that he is more than just the guy who rides Toothless, that she has supported him all through the years when his identity problems have arisen, and this helps him to come out of his little shell that he has built for himself. I genuinely love this scene, even if it's almost ripping off the first movie, going so far as to reuse some lines. But rather than feeling like, hey look, fan service, the Hidden World recognizes that it is a movie closing a trilogy, and so explicitly calls back to many standout moments from its predecessors to sell the close of those story arcs and thematic through lines. It's solid, super solid, and ending the climactic sequence by having everyone free the dragons the main group just fought to save is a beautifully poignant moment. Hiccup finally lets go of Toothless, and Toothless finally has a new future, along with all the other dragons, out in the Hidden World. Speaking of, let's talk about the handful of gripes I have with the film. The first is with the Hidden World itself. I get that the filmmakers needed something for Hiccup to distractingly aim for, like they did in the second, because this is ultimately still kind of a kids' movie, and following the same approximate structure makes sense. That said, forcing flashbacks into the threequel when How to Train Your Dragon 2 had a couple already, leaving these to feel a bit overwrought, was not the preferred way I would have liked to see it. Furthermore, making Stoic, of all characters, want to find the Hidden World just seems so wrong to me. Stoic's distaste for the dragons makes his discussing it with little kid Hiccup, especially when, as far as I can remember, it's never mentioned in the first two movies, made the existence of it just feel unearned. It's not a bad concept by any means, I just don't think it has enough going for it. Using Stoic and flashback material to build it up just didn't work in my opinion, and I also wasn't super into Kid Hiccup. He should have been cute, but it didn't really work for me besides setting rather direct juxtaposition to the epilogue. And that's not the only thing I didn't love about the Hidden World. Most of these are the minorest of gripes, but they are gripes all the same. Rough Nut, when temporarily imprisoned by Grimmel before being let go, was absolutely mind-numbing and insufferable. Obviously, this is the point, and the reason why Grimmel's plans with her changed to letting her lead him to the Burkians, but this sequence did not need to go on for this long to make the point. It's funny for the first little while, but then I found myself skipping 15 seconds ahead just to get it the heck over with. The Hidden World continues the trend of its immediate predecessor by making certain characters, such as Rough Nut and Tough Nut for example, more cartoonish than they needed to be. Though I like that this film does do a little bit more with the primary side characters than does the second movie, it also takes them into a more caricature-ish direction, which has me worried for a live-action remake if they manage to get that far. More on the same point, this third movie has even more stuff that has me really curious to see how a live-action would execute on it as well. Not that they'd have to change very much still, because they wouldn't, but the films do gradually increase the ceiling over time in a way that has me worried that the director will decide to gradually go a new direction with the live actions instead of holding true to them. I don't doubt that he's able to keep that heart, as the first remake did just that, but I'm also dubious. It wouldn't be the first time somebody got overzealous. There are generally just a bit more actual plot contrivances in this film. Most of these are still pretty minor, but instances such as all the dragons breaking out of their cages in the climax doesn't really make sense. I found The Hidden World to be slightly more immersion-breaking in this way than the earlier installments. But we're coming up on the end of the review now, and there's one final thing I have also been skirting around: the epilogue itself. Honestly, what can I even say about this? It's just so good. After the falling action of the film sees Hiccup encouraging Toothless to stake out on his own, the master of this herd of dragons, and with a partner, I was utterly distraught. Much like Hiccup himself, I too had to combat the identity crisis the character has gone through over these 3 films. That pervasive theme is so well concluded in those moments that I wound up bereft knowing that it was for the best. This is just a frickin' movie, man. Why is it killing me so hard to watch? The epilogue turns what was maybe the most bittersweet ending I've ever seen into a beautiful one all around. The Burkians are forced to relearn life without dragons, but this time without dragons at all. Hiccup's monologue throughout ties the world of these films to the real world by letting it be a personal story he's telling his kids, rather than speaking to us, the viewers. He talks about how there were dragons once, and how about maybe someday the world will be able to learn about them. All the while, the film shows us Hiccup and Astrid overcoming whatever personal issues they were having and marrying, before showing us the very kids Hiccup is presumably speaking to in the monologue, joining Hiccup and Astrid as Hiccup locates Toothless again out in the world. The epilogue depicts Toothless and the Light Fury with baby dragons of their own, and Toothless jumping on their boat to protect his family, before clicking in and realizing the man before him is Hiccup. We witness Hiccup and Astrid take rides with their children on the dragons, witnessing that beauty for themselves, all while the monologuing continues on. I get goosebumps just thinking about the close of this movie. Though through much of its runtime I felt distinctly like it was my least favorite, in spite of the aspects of consistency I feel like it has, the epilogue closes the movie more brilliantly than I could have hoped, and it does more than that. It convinced me that How to Train Your Dragon might just be one of the best film trilogies out there. So, that turned out both longer than I had hoped, and shorter than I had thought it would. I had set out to write this video, and based on the notes I had taken, feared that it would end up being like an hour long. Maybe like 50 minutes if I was lucky. I managed to keep the section about the first film fairly brief on account of covering the remake a couple weeks ago. The section about the sequel was a bit longer, but I ultimately thought I kept it at a manageable length. They led me to foolishly believe I could keep the whole video down to a 35 to 40 minute final runtime. Evidently, I didn't manage to meet that. But I didn't run that much over long. It's just that The Hidden World, being a legitimate first-time viewing, I had a little bit more to say about it, and it being the most analytically rich of the films, in my opinion, made it all too difficult to even keep it to the 3,100 words it ended up being, compared to the first two movies' respective 1,400 and 2,100 words. Saying that, I don't want to waste any more time at the end here. I just want to thank you for watching it if you did. I hope you enjoyed my commentary, though I have not the resources to be able to include film footage overtop my ramblings like I had thought I would be able to before making this video. Let me know in the comments below what you think of these three movies. How would you rank them? In the end, I have a really hard time doing that because each one is stronger in different areas. In the end, the first movie has the least things to complain about, so it's at the top of my ranking. Because I'm an ending kind of person and satisfying conclusions do more good and disappointing endings more bad than anything else a film can offer me, my second place is probably The Hidden World, with the middle movie resting at the bottom. But considering all three of these are minimum 4 out of 5 star affairs, and 2 of those at that, ultimately coming to 4.5 out of 5 as I write this, it's no real slight in my mind to rank them. That means I ultimately decided upon 4.5 out of 5 for The Hidden World, obviously. If you appreciated my reviews of these movies, it would mean the world to me if you would drop the video a like. If you have Letterboxd, you can also check out my profile over there in the description below, and you can like the 3 reviews as I have posted them there independently if you want. You don't have to do any of that, but it'd make the long few days of actually writing these things that much more worth it. Thank you so much again for watching. For now, I've been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.